Hi, everybody. Welcome. I'm really excited today to host this webinar on one of my absolutely favorite topics, culture. That mystical secret ingredient that can make one company stand out from another. But how do you define it? How do you build it? How do you maintain it? And how do you measure it? Many times I've been asked over my career, how do you build a great culture? So this webinar today will explore how to get your culture right in 2022. My name is Trent Innes. I'm the CEO of Compono, and I'm joining you live from Brisbane today. I'm so fortunate to be joined by two amazing people who are going to help me explore this topic. Sarah McCann-Bartlett, the CEO of ARI. Welcome, Sarah. How are you?
I'm great, thanks, Trent.
Fantastic. Great. Well, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate you taking the time to spend with us today. And my other guest is Clayton Pyne, the CEO of Humanforce. Welcome, Clayton. How are you?
Well, thanks, Trent. Hi, everyone. Great to be here.
Fantastic. That's awesome. So look, we are going to open it up to questions later on as well. So as we're going through a bit of a presentation, and then we're going to do a panel after that, if there are some questions that are burning that you would love to ask, please feel free to put them in the Q&A section, and we'll try to get through as many of those as we possibly can. We'll probably allow about 15 minutes towards the end of the webinar to do that. But before we get into this discussion, I want to take 10 or 15 minutes to tell you a little story about cultural alignment and just how subjective it can be. This is a very personal story that actually happened to me a couple of years back. So this is obviously a coffee. It's called a Magic. Even though I'm in Brisbane today, I'm actually from Melbourne, and we're pretty passionate about our coffee down in Melbourne. And this is my coffee of choice, the Magic. So how does coffee align to culture? In my previous life, I used to be the managing director of Xero for Australia and Asia. And I joined Xero in the very, very early days, right back in 2013. And I think I was either employee 30, 31, 32, something around that in Australia, but very, very, very early on. And back in the days where not many people knew about us. At that point in time, we were going through a lot of scale, and we were a very values-led organization. Even though we had official values, we also had some sort of unofficial ones. And I always get a little bit funny about sharing this old photo of mine, but you got to remember this is way back in the early days of Xero. So I won't read through all of those because some of them are not necessarily politically correct, but you have to remember it's very, very early days as we were growing. And one of the ones was wash your own coffee cup. And what that really meant was in those early days, a lot of our roles were not really defined. And there's a bit of an expectation that you had to wear many hats and do lots of many things. And wash your own coffee cup was about the most basic way we could think of in terms of ownership. So the idea was behind this: if you were willing to wash your own coffee cup, you were willing to do most things inside the organization, the things that had to be done. If you met a customer at a barbecue one day and they had a problem with the product and they mentioned it to you, we didn't expect you to go and fix it, but it'd be great for you to actually own it and actually come back to the office and say, I met this customer and I'm happy to help them through this process. Over time, we grew. And as I mentioned, I was there in the very early days, and the business grew and grew and grew around me. And I think in this photo, there's give or take 600 people in Xero in Australia at that point in time. And I'm sure it's probably more than double that now because I left a little bit over 12 months ago. But one of those little post-it notes that actually stuck with us the whole way through was wash your own coffee cup. And it became like a bit of an ethos inside the organization. So much so that it actually became an award. And so our workplace experience team put together an award. This was a very highly sought after award that people could be nominated for. And they won the Golden Coffee Cup. It's actually a spray painted coffee cup there. When you won this award, what you actually got was, for 1 month, you got to keep this on your desk. And you also got one free coffee from the local coffee shop. That was it. But it was a very highly sought after award. But more importantly, you had to add something to it that was personal about you, something that meant something to you. So over time, it grew. So there is actually a coffee cup in the middle of there. You can kind of see the handle a little bit within there, and people have added things onto them that meant something to them. So it became something about their cultural heritage, something about their background, something that was really important to them. I'm not sure what the sponge meant, but there was a sponge there, or there might be something related to washing a coffee cup. I'm not sure. But the trophy grew and grew over time. And even within COVID and during the pandemic, it actually morphed into a virtual trophy as well. So potentially the world's ugliest employee award trophy, I would have thought, but also in some ways the most beautiful because it actually represented so many aspects of the diversity and inclusion within the organization at that time. So what has this actually got to do with culture? I want to talk to you a little bit about a storm in a coffee cup and just a little bit about just how subjective culture can actually be. Back on Tuesday, the 28th of May, 2019, I did a podcast. At that point in time, I used to do a lot of podcasts. And one of the things I quite often talked about in terms of scaling was hiring for attitude, not just skills, knowledge, and experience. Attitude's quite binary. You can develop skills, you can acquire knowledge, you can gain experience, but attitude was something that was quite a little bit subjective, making sure that people fitted in an environment. And I did this podcast this day, and I remember doing it. I was on the side of the road. I actually did it on my mobile phone. And I used to always agree to do these podcasts, especially about scaling companies, because it was something I'm really, really passionate about. So as I did this podcast, the interviewer said to me, so, what are the sort of things that you believe? And I said, I think it's really important to hire for attitude. And he said, well, how do you do that? And I said, well, one of the things that is part of what makes us special is that people are willing to wash their own coffee cup. And we explored a little bit about what that meant. And he said to me, so how do you test for that in interviews? That's a pretty special word, test. We'll come back to that a bit later on. How do you test for that in interviews? And I said, it's actually really hard. Attitude's quite hard to actually look for in interviews. And anyone that's done a lot of interviews will know that skills, knowledge, and experience are quite easy to look for, but actual attitude and cultural fit is something that is, it's quite, it can be quite up to the individual who's actually going. It can be a bit of bias in there sometimes as well. But one of the things I said was quite fascinating is that, when someone comes in for an interview, and at that point in the role as managing director, sometimes when they come in, they can be a little bit nervous. And so you want to make sure that they feel comfortable and you get to see the best of that person. I would always take them for a walk through to the kitchen and they'd end up with a tea or a coffee or a water or a soft drink or whatever it is that they might like. We then go back and do the formal interview. And generally by then, they're actually far more relaxed and we'd sit there. And what I said to the interviewer was, but one thing I always get fascinated by is at the end of the interview, were they asked to take their empty cup back to the kitchen. Now, the reality is actually about 9 out of 10 people, I think, if I think back, when I interview them, will actually say, oh, what would you like me to do with this? And of course, I don't expect them to take them back to the kitchen by any means, but we joked about it a bit on the podcast. And then I thought, nothing more of it. And that was kind of the end of the podcast, typical everyday podcast. A couple of days later on the Friday, so we're now on the Friday night, I'm just about to get on a plane and because flying home from Sydney to Melbourne. And I got a phone call from one of my colleagues who said, you're not going to, for some reason, you're on the ABC News on the radio. And I was like, really? What about? I haven't done any interviews this week, apart from that podcast, which I didn't really think about, saying apparently that you won't hire anyone that won't wash their own coffee cup. I was like, did I actually say that? I was playing back through my head and I was like, I laughed it off and said, oh, don't worry about it. It'll go away. I can't believe it's on the ABC radio. And I hadn't actually seen the article that had hit at that point in time. Then the next morning, I was at the gym. And I'm at the gym and I'm looking up at the screens and I went, uh-oh, I think that's actually me. And they're actually talking about me in the coffee cup test that if you wouldn't wash your own coffee cup, then I wouldn't actually employ you, which is not actually really what I said. It was a bit of a joke. And of course I would employ someone that washed their own coffee cup. Once again, didn't think much about it. I thought this will just go away, it'll blow over, but don't worry about it. Then the next day it starts to get a little bit ugly. And I won't actually read out the words, but this came through as a tweet, and it started to get a little bit weird. Then I started to have a bit of a oh no moment. What's actually going on here? As it started to get a bit more explosive on social media, and I couldn't believe how divisive it was. Just about thinking about, would you employ someone that wash your own coffee cup or would you not? Then it started going international. So all of a sudden now it's actually appeared in the Daily Mail in the UK. So it's gone from a little podcast on the side of the road on my mobile phone, and now we're starting to go global. And this is within a week of actually the original interview. And now it's starting to get translated. I had to have a bit of test. I've worked out what the word coffee is in so many different languages over this journey. But this is actually, I think this is in Poland. Someone will probably pick me up for that. I think hopefully that's correct. it's now getting translated into all these different languages and starting to go viral. So I think I was in Perth at that point in time, and I was starting to think, oh my God, how big is this thing getting? And so my PR team at that point in time, my comms team, then sent me some information to say within 1 week, it had reached Australia, New Zealand, Indonesia, the UK, Ireland, America, Croatia, Poland, Portugal, China, and the Netherlands. It had been broadcast 54 times. I think it was on TV in Nebraska on NBC or something like that. And it had been in 250 print online clips with an estimated reach of 183 million. And it kept going and kept growing. Then it did actually get a little bit ugly for a while, I'll be honest, and the trolling began. So I don't think I actually really probably knew what Lad Bible was at that point in time, but I've got teenage daughters, and one of them actually got tagged into this at that point in time. And he said, hey, isn't this your dad? And she went back and said, yes, it is. And then all this trolling started to happen off the back of that as well. And once again, it's starting to change a little bit now, saying boss uses the same coffee cup trick in every interview and won't hire anyone who fails, which of course I don't do in every single interview and would never not hire anyone at all. I just want to reiterate that. It then got translated into China. So we're now in China mainstream news. Indonesia. I'm not even really sure where that was. That was an old photo of me that was actually dragged out one night when I was at Officeworks for some reason. I don't even know where that photo came from. But yeah, so what was the wrap up? So I won't read out all the countries that it actually got to, but it ended up reaching, I think, an estimated reach of 425 million people over 2 weeks, which is quite amazing when you think about it. But what did it really mean? And what was the actual aftermath? So what was fascinating is I had literally hundreds of messages come through on LinkedIn over this time. And what was really fascinating was I think 99% of them were positive. 99% of them were actually positive, saying it's okay to define your culture. In fact, it's really important. If that's something that's really important to you as an organization, as a business, it's okay to actually say that. And so that came through very positive. I also got sent lots and lots of photos of dirty sinks, like literally hundreds of them. I have hundreds of photos of dirty sinks in offices where people would say, I've realized that the first step in our corporate dysfunction is that no one's willing to actually wash their own coffee cup inside our organization, and they'll just leave a mess for someone else to clean up. And it spread into lots and lots of other things, which I found very fascinating. So what did I actually learn through this process? It's actually really important to define and own your unique culture. Obviously went through a bit of pain going through that over a couple of weeks, but the more I reflected on it, it actually is super important to define it. Workplace culture is more important than ever, and it is very, very subjective. It can be very, very subjective and very unique to every organization. You need to choose your words carefully. I try not to use the word test ever again in any way, shape, or form, because that was that one word that I think actually undid me. You can't stop virality once it starts, and I'll be quite happy in my lifetime if I never go viral on anything ever again. Some people are just not very nice. And there's actually some people out there that don't want to wash their own coffee cup. And I think that's kind of okay as well. But I thought I'd share that story with you because I think it's quite a unique insight into some of the cultural impacts that organizations can have. So with that, I might just pivot a little bit across to Clayton and Sarah. Have you got any sort of personal cultural stories? Hopefully you haven't gone viral, but I'd be interested if you had any stories around culture as well.
Well, Trent, look, I was certainly just taking the esteemed pages of the Daily Mail off my bucket list, but I think the key takeaways here are super interesting. And I think just from a Humanforce perspective, perhaps, we work with deskless workforces, which are really shift and roster-driven workforces, and that's 80% of the world's working population. So when I think of war stories, if we cast our mind back over the last several years, we've endured an incredibly tough period of time in our sort of collective history as humanity. And it's really been those frontline workforces, those what we're now calling essential workforces that have endured a lot of the pain and challenge throughout the last 2 years. So we've had a front row seat to that, serving our customers and partnering with them through those times. And really, it's been incredibly inspiring. I mean, in Australia, we have 2.4 million casual hourly paid workers, right? We've had customers in the aged care setting, as one example, send corporate staff out into their sites, right? Just to help out, work on administration, support, their RNs, right? Aged care is a setting that really brings this to life for me. It's an area where we talk about, the visa waiting lists and skilled migration. And sometimes we have these really lofty goals around culture. And we'll talk a lot more about that today as it pertains to deskless workforces. But really just getting stuck in, for me, culture is what you do. It's the behaviors that you're willing to kind of try and set standards around and tolerate and inspire and motivate in your organization. And so for us, seeing so many of our customers, whether it be retail and hospitality that was largely shut down, so many of our customers in the care space really just show up, and it was the doing, right, that inspired us at Humanforce so much in terms of some of those war stories. But again, not looking to personally perhaps go viral nonetheless. But Sarah, I'm sure you've got your take perhaps as well.
Well, I've certainly hit the Daily Mail before, but not in a viral sense. And Trent, as you were talking, your story really parallels what a lot of us do, and that is when we're interviewing. When the the candidate actually leaves, we will go and ask either the person on reception or the person who walked them to the interview room and just say, what were they like beforehand? And that gives us an insight into how they deal with people that potentially they're not specifically focused on. What I want to talk about just quickly is when I started to realize how important culture was in an organization. And it was really early on in my career. It was actually in my first graduate role, although I use the term career. I don't even think I was thinking about it as a career at that point. The managing director of my organization invited me to sit in on a meeting he and the executive team were having with one of the Chinese vice premiers and his entourage. It was related to my job. I was an analyst on the Asia desk. But that meeting, that opportunity actually set me on my career path, as I realized that if I wanted to do amazingly interesting things like that all the time, or at least some of the time, I needed to be in a more senior position. That simple act of noticing me in my position and giving me the opportunity to sit in really reflected a learning culture where even the MD actively created development opportunities for people like me, for graduates like me. That one Saturday morning, and I remember the details as if it was yesterday, has really driven me to try and build and focus on organizational cultures that support development, but cultures that also create that special spark of joy, of commitment, of this is the place for me, I've got purpose in my role for employees. And the fact is, we're over 20 years on, and it is like it was yesterday for me. And it's really cemented for me that importance of culture in an organization.
Yeah, it's so amazing how those small moments to the person that did it probably didn't think that much about it, but they created an environment where that was what they did. And it's obviously had a massive impact on you and your career, and you still remember it. And I think we've all got little stories like that throughout our history as well. And I think definitely through my working career, I think in the early days, I don't think people talked a lot about culture. Whereas today, we are actively talking about culture and talking about, the impact that has on our workplaces. And of course, culture can be positive or negative. There can be great workplaces and not so great workplaces as well. And we'll probably explore a little bit of that later on as well. But before we get into that, I'm actually going to hand back over to you, Sarah, as well, because Ari's just recently released a report which has some fascinating insights into hybrid working. And I was hoping you might be able to walk us through some of those findings.
Terrific. So we surveyed over 1,000 HR professionals across Australia in July and August this year. And the purpose of the research was to do a bit of a check-in and exploration of hybrid working and flexible working practices. So headline, before the pandemic, around 23% of employees were reported to be working from home at least one day a week. This is from the 1,000 people who responded, HR professionals. Post-pandemic, they're estimating overall that it's around 58% of employees through their businesses. Really interestingly, top challenges that they noted in terms of remote working were a feeling of disconnection between colleagues. So 65% of them said they can really see that feeling of disconnection between colleagues in their organisations, and actually working out how to create staff collaboration and cooperation. That was really tough. And they're telling us that there's some pressure to return to the physical workplace, with 75% of them saying that the pressure is coming from senior management, who are wanting to require employees to attend the office more often. Funnily enough, given your coffee cup story, Trent, the incentives to return tended to centre around coffee and food, but also social opportunities as well. Over 50% of the HR professionals that we surveyed said that they felt that working from home or remote working arrangements would remain the same over the next 2 years. 25% predicted that the rate of working from home and remote working will increase, with 17% saying that rates would decrease. We have been talking a lot about remote working, either in the physical office or working from home or elsewhere. But organisations are also offering flexible working opportunities. Part-time working, flexible working hours are pretty mainstream and were definitely around before the pandemic. But others that we're starting to see being talked about a bit more: career breaks, purchasing additional leave, and particularly compressed working, which is slightly different to 4-day working week, of course. But compressed working looks to be one of the areas that a number of organisations have said they're going to expand as opportunities to create different kinds of flexible working opportunities for employees, with compressed working the most popular. So why is this interest in remote working, but particularly more flexible working? Well, first of all, there's the productivity view. Our research showed that HR professionals felt that there was a productivity advantage to hybrid working, but there's also a really major retention imperative at the moment. We've also done a bit of work around voluntary turnover, and we've been polling our members on LinkedIn since October last year to actually track voluntary turnover, and that goes to this sort of retention imperative. I'm putting my hands up, absolutely not scientific. It is a LinkedIn poll of RE members, but it gives us a view. So every month from November last year, between 30% and 40% of respondents, and a couple of times it went over the 40%, have said that their voluntary turnover rates over 20% were over 20%. So if you think about what is your voluntary turnover, is it greater than 20%? Between 30 and 40% of companies said, yep, we're seeing a 12-month voluntary turnover of 20% over that sort of almost 12-month period. And most months, 20 to 30% of companies had a voluntary turnover of over 25%.
And was there any insight, Sarah, at all about why that voluntary turnover is actually climbing?
There was a lot of qualitative conversation around it in this forum and in other forums. There's definitely the pent-up, I'm going to call it pent-up demand to move. So we had 2 years of COVID. Employees were pretty nervous. A number of organisations were either putting people on shorter working hours, had types of shutdowns, had a series of redundancies, and there was nervousness about a COVID-induced recession as well among employees. So there was a lot of sort of sitting still, and perhaps previous moving intentions were put on hold. So I think there was some pent-up demand around that. There's also been the inflationary effect around concerns that from a real wages point of view, there were better opportunities elsewhere. And we've certainly seen an increase in what I'll call poaching employees, but sort of very, very, very actively targeting either individuals and teams from other organisations and bringing them across, and things like sign-on bonuses, etc., that were very attractive and created additional movement. And I think another COVID effect was definitely around that purpose and that employee value proposition. What is my purpose? Is my role actually making a difference? And Clayton, you've talked about those essential workers. You know, we all looked at those essential workers and our admiration for them and what they did and their contribution to not just their immediate customers and clients, but their contribution to the community was something that we deeply felt. And many people have said, you know, I really now want to do something meaningful. So I think that, and of course, closed borders had a lot to do with it. So I think there were a number of drivers, but certainly when I started this poll, I didn't expect the voluntary turnover numbers to remain so high for such a long period of time.
Which I think goes to show just how important culture is at the moment. People want to work at places where they have purpose, where they're aligned to the values, and where they can actually enjoy themselves, where they actually go to work and have a great day. So I think, you know, culture has become more important than ever. And it's actually now, it's not a nice to have anymore. It's a have to have if you want to stand out in terms of attracting and retaining amazing people.
And I think that just speaking about this immediate post-COVID period, one of the things I do say a lot is, if as an organisation you're not undertaking a culture review at the moment, or you haven't done one recently, or at the very, very least gone back and done a check-in on your values and behaviours, you're probably being left behind. You really need to look at that, because the environment has changed so significantly.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and culture, at the end of the day, to me, culture is an output of purpose, values, and most importantly, behaviors. It's those, and I think leaders can define the purpose and the values of a business or an organization, but it's the behaviors that come from everywhere that ultimately, those small moments of truth are the bits that actually make up your culture, either positively or negatively. Yeah, it's absolutely an output. Thanks, Sarah. That was some amazing insight. Any comments from you, Clayton, before we move on to the panel discussion?
No, that was great, Sarah. I think we can dive into the panel. Trent?
Fantastic, great. All right, so look, we'll now move on to the panel discussion. Thank you so much, Sarah, again. Look, I just want to say once again as well, if you do have any questions, please put them in the Q&A section, and we will get to those after the panel discussion. But it's fair to say, you know, we're in a fascinating time as we emerge from the pandemic and return to work, but probably not as before. So the way we work has changed, maybe forever. And you know, I've worked in technology pretty much my whole career, and so we've always had the ability to work remotely. That's not the same. We were a minority, really, in the whole scheme of things. The way that we worked was a very small subsegment of the overall working economy, and you know, we were lucky enough to be actually set up for that environment. With other businesses have had to catch up to that. They now start to see the benefits of it. Our education system had to catch up with that, and we're definitely a very different environment. So we're having discussions about, you know, remote working, the deskless workforces, and of course, do we return to the office? I get that question a lot. Do we return to the office? When do we return to the office? What does that actually look like? So as leaders, you know, are we prepared for this change? And more importantly, what does it actually mean to culture? You know, I don't think that many leaders were actually ever really taught, or many managers were actually given any insights into how to manage in a remote environment. I think we'll touch on that as well, because building culture in an office where everyone sort of gathers around is a lot easier than it is remotely or a deskless environment. So I might start with Clayton. So Clayton, so in the current reality of the world we find ourselves now, what do leaders and business owners need to be thinking about in terms of building and maintaining culture in the current world of work?
Yeah, Trent, it's a very topical question for us. And when you think about the deskless workforce, and I want to build on this concept of flexibility, because so much of the narrative and the rhetoric is really focused on the white collar workforce. It's about returning to an office. But that's not the reality, and it never has it been the reality for a deskless workforce that might be in an aged care facility or in a childcare centre or in a retail shop or a chef or someone standing behind a bar in a hospitality venue. And so for us, what we see in the customer conversations that I'm having is that first and foremost, this concept of flexibility is as relevant for deskless workforces, but it's slightly different in the sense that it really is about giving workers the ability to manage their working life. So flexibility to a shift or a roster worker is setting my availability to work. It's bidding on and swapping shifts. It's being able to communicate with my peers and managers and close that gap between sort of head office and maybe the aspiration and the reality of what it's been like on the frontline workforce. And so, so much of what I'm hearing and seeing and feeling throughout our customer base is a conversation where there is this focus on the employee experience now. And Trent, to your point, it has changed forever. I mean, I've been in and around our business for around 6 years now. And I think historically, it's fair to say that, our customers looked at us as a, sort of clock on the wall, driving the cost optimization, compliance, and productivity. And these values remain absolutely central. Of course they do. But what's come into the conversation now is, how do you help me with the attraction, retention of talent? How do you help me with my deskless kind of EVP, right? And this is front and center. And so, at Humanforce, we believe that the shift is the front door to that conversation around employee experience. Because if you're a deskless worker, typically shift or roster driven, it's your availability to work and getting access to those opportunities that is really most primal to you, right? If we think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, it's kind of like get food and shelter right before we race to self-actualization, right? So this is a workforce that's been maybe underserved at times by technology in the hands of workers to help them, with that sort of working life equation that they face. And so, we're starting to talk a lot more to our customers around sort of flexibility. How do you really address that? Engagement, sort of closing that empathy gap with your workforce, right? The listening, the surveys, right? It's the learning. Where's the next generation of hospitality leaders going to come from? I mean, my CFO here at Humanforce spent many years in hospitality, and he absolutely, obviously, could have been retained in that industry as a phenomenal contributor if that pathway was there for him. So I think career pathways around learning, again, very top of mind, as is the well-being equation. So, these are the 3 or 4 key things that we're starting to hear more on and talk more about and work with our customers. So that's kind of the top of mind trend as we see it and hear it from our customers.
So first of all, I'd like to say thank you so much for all our essential workers and especially teachers during the pandemic as well. It was amazing. So just listening to them try and teach remotely with my son, I felt very sorry for them and realized that my job's quite easy. But I think, you make a good point. And I think at the end of the day, it's really important that we be kind, but there is an opportunity as we come out of this that we think more holistically about the entire workforce than we probably have historically as well. So, I think we've got an opportunity as we do go into sort of level of permanent change to actually really think about it differently.
Yeah.
And sorry, Clayton, you go ahead.
No, go ahead, Sarah, please. Yeah.
And just a couple of examples from some of our members around this, thinking holistically, particularly about those who don't work in an office. One example I've got is a financial services company that's got retail shop fronts. And what they've done is they've actually trained up everybody in each of their retail shop fronts to do the frontline work, including all the managers. And that means that when they run their rosters, you can actually have a certain number of days a week, a fortnight, a month, actually working from home because everybody can do everybody else's roles. and they deliberately created that program of skills uplift and training in order to provide that flexible opportunity that previously only lay with managers. Another example is a manufacturing company that I know, and they looked at their shift patterns and they realized that they had a lot of working parents, and so they threw all their shifts up into the air, and instead of having 2 shifts a day, they created 3, with the middle one actually being a school hour shift. Unintended consequence was that they were able to attract and retain a lot more older workers, because the number of grandparents actually taking on caring responsibilities is huge. So not only have they been able to retain existing working parents, but they've been able to retain and attract those important older workers and bring in additional workers in a particularly tight labour market. So they're just a couple of examples where organisations have thought really flexible about adding flexibility as part of their EVP.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. Thank you, Clayton. Hey, Sarah, you and I caught up the other day, and you mentioned something to me which I found quite fascinating. And you put something, I can't remember exactly what I said, but you put it much more nicely into great words than I did at the time. But you mentioned the psychological contract. So what do you mean by that, and can you explain it to the audience?
Look, the psychological contract is really the unwritten contract that employers and employees have with each other. It's probably been taken over a little bit by employee value proposition, but they probably run parallel to each other. So in the old days, it was that I would give you as an employee a really good day's work in return for some job stability that's never written into an actual contract, and a pretty decent working environment. So that's with a little bit outside the written contract. But we've seen, particularly over the pandemic, that has grown. And again, putting some of the legislative requirements around health and safety, psychological safety, there's definitely a viewpoint that from an employee point of view, I expect more of my employer. I expect them to provide me with career pathways, opportunities, you talked about Maslow, Clayton, to actually help me self-actualize and really do something that I love. So we hear about employers that actually allow and give employees opportunities to work on passion projects that potentially align with something they're passionate about outside the business, but also will support the business's purpose. And so that's this growth of a real focus on well-being, focus on work-life balance. A lot of these things aren't specifically worked into contracts. They're part of that psychological contract, the expectation that in return for me coming and working, it's way more than what's written in my contract and what's written down in policies. And when we talk about employee value proposition, what we're talking about is the unwritten psychological contract.
Yeah, and I suppose with the, given we're seeing such low levels of unemployment at the moment, is it fair to say in some ways that, we talked a little bit about just how important culture is now to help you stand out from the crowd, but would it be fair to say now that, part of the power has really shifted to the employee now rather than the employer, in that they've got more choice, and some of those numbers you showed before would sort of highlight that as well?
Look, I don't necessarily like power. Talking about power imbalances. I think you and I have talked about this already. Yeah. Trent, but certainly the current environment, historically low unemployment, closed borders, still not necessarily sorting out the inward flow of employees from overseas quite yet, and potentially a little bit of reluctance of people living overseas to look at Australia as a really great place to go, because we've got a little bit of that lockdown, lockout without overhang. But certainly the current environment has made employers think about what is great about working here. What is it that I can offer? And it might not be, when we talk about power, it probably, our mind immediately goes to salary, wages, and other benefits that you can assign a dollar value to. But actually, when we talk about EVP, why is this a great place to work? Does it align with my purpose and my values? These are things that are all wrapped up in that terminology, culture. Is it diverse? Would I feel like I belonged here? And is it somewhere where I want to build a career, or I want to stay?
Yeah, and I've definitely, I know throughout my career, we've definitely seen a massive shift there. I think, if I go back to earlier in my careers, you almost had to wear a different persona when you went to the workplace. You had to become that workplace. You had to almost put out both a physical and a mental suit when you went there. Whereas now, I think people are much more willing. The environments are much more diverse and inclusive. And I think that, as that's reflected out, it actually makes you far more appealing to the broader workforce.
And it's also, when we talk about culture and when we think about the way in the past we've talked about culture, there is a risk that when we think about cultural fit, and we're moving from cultural fit to cultural add, that, are they a really good fit for us? Well, actually, do we want a homogenous culture? And the answer, we know now, the answer is no, we actually don't. We want people who align with our values, our behaviors, who do make it a great place to work and who get the work done. We can't forget about the purpose, but it is about diversity, belonging, inclusion, and actually having diversity in all its aspects, including diversity of thought, problem solving, experience, lived experience.
And Clayton, have you, what sort of tips might you have as well in terms of how would you, if people on the webinar today, if they're thinking about how they build out their culture, how do they harness their culture in the current environment, any sort of tips that they should be thinking about?
Yeah, well, just building on Sarah's previous comment around the war for talent. I mean, to bring that to life in our setting, just to reiterate that, just the care example, I was in the Fin Review recently. There was a certain segment of the skilled migrant visa kind of conversation, and there were this particular area of the list, there was like 60,000 folks waiting, and of the 60,000 in this particular portion, only 32 were registered nurses. Yet we know the sector at a minimum needs 41,000 workers to get to be sort of adequately staffed, and possibly even 100,000 to be at a best practice level. And so these are existential challenges that some of our customers are facing. And so, and again, the individual needs, I think, is a really important point. And for us, it is that conversation that's really emerging very quickly that I've seen, and it's been sort of COVID-induced due to the lack of talent, but it's stepping up our collective game around EVP. And for us, hitting on things like well-being, which I think Trent and Sarah, you've both spoken about, is really central. We see both great outcomes at the worker level with our focus around, let's say, a financial well-being, the ability to provide workers with opportunities to build their savings, better meet their financial obligations by having access to their earned wages. But for the business, this starts to improve shift uptake, overtime acceptance. It starts to improve time to recruit. And so there is this nexus or synergy between being able to offer and cater for that diversity, that individual need. And Sarah, you spoke, very eloquently about sort of shift patterns and fairness and justice in shift allocation, right? Around shift preferences of workers and allocation of those shifts to workers, and this becoming really central to the conversation as well. And so these are areas that can be both great for the worker, and phenomenally amazing for the business. And so this is a really important point that we try and demonstrate in the data as we turn on some of these areas of our business and the partnerships we're building to better cater for, let's say, the well-being, the mental, physical, and financial well-being of what is, for our customers, those workers are a high churn workforce typically, right? So how we can better work on lowering that sort of churn rate, which has been a great challenge, in recent months for, I think, all of us. But also, beyond the well-being piece, this learning component and career pathways. Again, it speaks to the individual being able to listen and poll and survey and understand with intention. You don't have to do a lot of things, but we really believe that learning and those career pathways around those next generation leaders is really, really important, in, say, hospitality, retail, etc. Areas of our economy that, students are a big part of those workforces. And yet the education sector, as you pointed out, Trent, has gone through a transformation around remote learning. So, these are obviously great challenges we have as a nation, but I think, we absolutely have the agency to act on how we show up and the proposition that we take that is both great for the team and also great for the business.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you so much. We've actually got quite a few questions come through. So we might, this is always the difficult part where you try to read them at the same time as and answer them and find the right person to answer them. So I'll do the best I possibly can. But the first one I've got is, how often should a cultural review take place for an SME? Who wants to have a go at that one?
I'll kick off. And the first thing I'll say is, as an SME, don't be overwhelmed by the terminology culture review. There are different things that you can do. Clayton's already talked about talking to employees, understanding where the organisation is. So it could kick off with a short survey, some discussion groups, and a look at values and behaviours in terms of, is this the organisation that we want it to be, and how do we actually shift those, and what does that look like on the ground? So those sorts of cultural reviews can be done pretty easily every few years, but particularly if something significant is changing. So let's say you went through rapid expansion, you took on a completely different product or service line that meant that your stakeholders or customers were completely different. There are certain sort of external or internal shock moments where you might say, okay, it's time for a culture review. So there isn't necessarily a particular cadence or something that's necessarily said. But one of the things I will say is, understanding what's going on the ground is really important on a consistent basis. And Clayton, you've already talked about that, ways of getting feedback from employees. There are many, many ways to do that, but not losing touch with what is actually happening on the ground is incredibly important, even if that does not lead to an overarching culture review. But looking at behaviours, tweaking, reminding, talking about them, finding a common language. I find that if an organisation has a common language to talk about values, behaviours and culture, that actually helps embed those behaviours and those values within the organisation. So there's some of the things that one can do when you're not doing a full-blown culture review.
Yeah, I was also thinking about, I've done a lot of work with small businesses over the last 8 years or so in my previous role, and some of the best cultures I've ever seen are actually in small businesses. In a lot of ways, they're a lot closer to the real action, to the front line than maybe a bigger corporate organisation might be. But the one thing I would say is, I think as a business owner or a leader, you need to be really honest and open with yourself around what the culture is, and not fool yourself into think that the culture might be something amazing that actually isn't the case at all. And the only way you can really do that is you have to ask questions. You have to be open. And we see this, you see this even in retail environments or hospitality environments that you go, and you can soon pick straight away if there's a great culture in there, because people, they look happy. they're treated well, they're treated respectfully, and you can see that shine through, and that comes all the way through to the customer experience as well.
And we did some research, goodness, it could be 5 years ago now, called 5 Hard Truths. And we asked different levels of the organisation a question around would employees cut corners ethically in order to deliver a business result? CEOs said 70% plus, no, absolutely not. Middle managers said, oh, well, about 50% of employees would, and the employees themselves said actually 70% of employees would. So CEOs had no clue what was actually going on and what the culture was in their organizations.
That's a bit scary. We've all got the title CEO. That's a little bit scary.
I think Trent, it underscores the idea that you've got to, for us to talk about like a frontline first culture. I mean, Sarah, you said it well. You've got to go to the ground. You've got to go to the coal face. You know, it's the moving between the balcony and the dance floor. You can't be in the ivory tower. And I think you said it well. It's so paramount. Yeah.
Well, at the end of the day, people are actually what glues strategy to execution. So you haven't got that bit right, the other bits are actually a bit of a waste of time. Other questions we went through. Can I please ask, what was your criteria for awarding the Golden Coffee Cup? So that actually wasn't awarded by me or anyone else. It was actually done by the workplace experience team themselves. And during the month, people would nominate colleagues that they would see within the workforce that had done something outstanding against the values, with the values, and would actually nominate them. And then there was a small subset of people who would actually go through those. And it came from the ground up. Hence why I think it was actually such an amazing award. So it wasn't awarded down; it was actually awarded within, which has made it so special. I think it was probably in a lot of ways the most special award that we had. What are the biggest challenges for getting culture right post-pandemic? We've probably touched on this a little bit, but Clayton, do you want to touch on that any more?
Look, post-pandemic, I think, we've covered it quite well. I mean, here at Humanforce, talking a bit more about our business, obviously during COVID, I think it was that human connection component, moving to remote ways of working. I mean, we were well geared up with the right tooling process. I think what I learned during COVID and coming out of COVID as well is just the power of leadership, right? Your first line leaders, right? And so I think in a variety of different contexts and settings, leaders as leverage is a really important concept. And having them, I think, really ultimately, they are your ultimate sort of points of cultural awareness and understanding, cultural champions. And so for us as Humanforce internally, as we come out of the pandemic, we've got a great focus on our leaders and leader development. And that's a statement around purpose and vision, which is really the heart, of this entire conversation around where are we headed and why are we doing what we do, and tapping into that intrinsic motivation. But obviously, coming back to culture is you can put ping pong tables in lunchrooms, you can put things on walls, but bottom line, I'm a big believer that culture is about behaviors in the end, and really that's about great leaders, and that's where our focus lies coming out of the pandemic at Humanforce.
I think it's great leaders, and I also think it's about empowering, like truly empowering your people. That's right. My personal view is if you've actually got strong values that people are aligned to, that actually is the guardrails of your business in many, many ways. And actually it doesn't mean it means you don't need as many rules anymore. So because you're actually empowering your people. With empowerment comes accountability as well, but they'll feel better about it and feel like they can actually have an impact, in my experience.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's right. I think it's two sides of the coin. It's the empowerment and the accountability. And I think in the candor around that feedback, direct, timely, consistent, this is where I think you can reinforce values. And as Drucker said, culture eats strategy for breakfast, I think, right? The famous quote that we had to get that one in here, surely, team. Yeah. But, I think as I've gone on my own personal journey, it's easy to cast it aside as a cliche, but I think you learn over and again that it truly is the ultimate beacon and guardrail for the business. And it's certainly true as you scale and grow.
Absolutely. I think the next one might be a good one for you, actually, Sarah. It's a bit of a long one, so bear with me. We've been taken over by a large company in the US and have gone from a strong, small brand with amazing culture of less than 200 people to a huge brand with over 20,000 people. How do you assimilate two cultures? Is this fair? We now have 9 values to live by and feel overwhelmed and not understood.
I'm going to make the assumption that while the takeover has been US to Australia, there hasn't been an integration with a big organisation on the ground within Australia. I think the first thing is that there needs to be open and frank discussion within the organisation around what was really great about our organisation pre-takeover, and how can we actually look at those values and behaviours and actually keep the best of what we had. I think doing that kind of exercise and talking really openly about it, and talking openly about what employees' fears are in terms of the takeover, what might be lost, how can we actually retain those while still remaining broadly consistent with those new values that it feels like, or it sounds like to me, have been imposed. If you think about global organisations, they've forever had these sorts of issues where you've got a head office in some country saying, well, this is what our culture is and these are what our values and behaviours are, and you will, no matter what, actually adhere to them. What actually happens is that there's an interpretation, often along cultural lines, often around the way that the particular geographies have developed. But I think actually talking about it as an organisation and creating some sort of positive exercise that says, well, where is there alignment? How can we actually keep and grow within these new values and behaviours? What I would say is I don't think anybody would be expecting you to actually become a mini replica of that US head office. That's not how global culture actually works.
No, look, I would agree. I think, but I've been involved in quite a few merger and acquisitions over the journey, and culture is the hardest bit to get right. Cultural alignment is a bit that takes the most effort and the most work, and you've got to be very deliberate about it and actually make sure you actually spend time to do it. That's ultimately, in a lot of ways, where it will actually it should succeed or fail, will be the goal.
I'd also make one suggestion, which is potentially see if you can find an ally in the people and culture team in head office in the US, and actually create with them a dialogue around what some of the concerns are, fears are, how can you work together to actually align culturally, but still keep what they actually bought in the first place. Because as well as buying the product and the service, they've actually bought your culture.
They have, absolutely. Now, I'm conscious we're down to 3 minutes. I'm going to be able to squeeze one more question in, but I'm very conscious of both of your time. What's the best incentive to get employees to return to work while keeping culture in mind? So, one for you, Clayton.
Look, I mean, I think about our customers, my customer hat on, it's flexibility, right? It really is what's resonating the most for us at Humanforce, really is this concept of flexibility. And so I believe it came through in Sarah's data earlier around some of the compressed working hours and hybrid arrangements and what's drawing folks in. I would agree with that entirely in terms of my own experience at Humanforce as the CEO of our business, but certainly for the customers that we serve, it really is giving them the ability to manage their working life and giving them a level of empowerment around that and focusing on outcomes. And I think this is naturally what so much of the workforce is looking for, and how you can solve for that while solving for the business. I think that's where the magic lies.
Yeah, I'd also say people have returned to work, but just not maybe in the way that we historically thought that they would. They're just working in a different way. And so we need now to, as leaders or owners, need to think a little bit about not just culture in mind, but what's the employee experience, and what is the experience that you're putting in place for your employees the best, most optimal one for the way that they now work?
Yeah, I think, Trent, what Sarah said earlier resonated with me as well. Is like what we've wanted to avoid at Humanforce is everyone coming in to sit on Zooms in the office, right? So you've got to give people great reasons to come together to do that, to build that connective tissue, and it's the more cerebral thinking, let's have a disagreeing commit moment, let's debate this. and you being very mindful and intentional around, you know, the organizational sort of points of connection and who you get in on what day and how that works. And, you know, we've really left that up to our leaders at Humanforce. It's really been a lot about sort of empowered leadership to make that work productively. And it's certainly been, you know, a great move for us. But yeah, you know, you can't have folks coming in and sitting on Zooms. It's that'll wear them out real quick.
Absolutely. Unfortunately, we're out of time. We had quite a few more questions to get through, and I really apologize to all those people that we can't get through those questions. But hopefully we'll be able to. Hopefully we can actually get a copy of those, and I'll work out how we can best come back and answer those for you. I just like to say big thank you to Clayton and Sarah. I really appreciate you joining us today for this webinar. There's some great insights that came out through it as well. So thank you so much. Great, always awesome to hear from some amazing leaders. Thank you to all the participants that came along as well, and especially thank you to all those people that actually asked questions. And finally, a thank you for the team in the background that actually put all this together as well. So there's actually a lot of work that goes on in the background to make these things happen. So a big thank you to you as well. And with that, I think we will say goodbye and good luck building your cultures in a post-pandemic world. Thank you so much.
Thanks all. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.